taking a look at the Walrus Meraki stereo analog delay. If you're a regular viewer of this channel, it is an almost certainty that you have seen somebody leave a comment, "Why not stereo?" on almost any given coverage of a mono delay, reverb, or modulation pedal. If you're a subscriber to this channel, there's like a 70% chance that you're the one who left that comment. And it's funny, I see comments like that get left almost regardless of whether or not it's feasible to make the device in question stereo. Sure, digital effects are one thing, but when you see comments like that on analog delays, it's kind of a head scratcher because like making an analog delay stereo, like true stereo, is a massive undertaking. You need twice as many delay chips. You need twice as many of almost everything under the hood of a device like that. A bigger enclosure, more costly R&D, a ton of bugs to try to like work out in terms of phase issues and everything else. Man, it is just such a crazy and reckless endeavor that I don't know who would undertake such a thing. That's called foreshadowing. This is the Walrus Meraki, and this is a true stereo analog delay. And when I say true stereo, I do mean that. Like, you have separate controls for feedback on the left and right channels. What happens on the left channel is represented on the left channel. This is not one of those sum to mono in the wet channel and then redistribute out to a stereo image. This is whatever comes in stereo comes out in stereo, but with delay in all the right places, with some caveats, and let's get into that as well. But let's start by talking about the control scheme of this pedal. For it being such a big, robust looking device, you'll notice that it looks pretty straightforward by all accounts, and that's because it is. You have a shared mix control top center. On the left and right sides, you have feedback for your left channel and your right channel. You have modulation, time, and tone. Time is going to go down to about 11 or 1200 milliseconds, giving you kind of some overclocked, crispy white noise textures at those kind of like longer, lower fi delay settings. Your tone control is going to be a tilt EQ, flat at noon, boosting lows and cutting highs as you go counterclockwise, and the inverse, cutting lows, boosting highs as you go clockwise, giving you options for murky, warm, dark repeats, or clear, bright, present, almost chipper analog rhythmic delays as well. The mod wheel here controls the depth of your modulation, but by pressing and holding your bypass, you can change the speed of the modulation, and by switching around with this switch in the bottom left, you have access to a sine, a square, and a random LFO. And on the other side over here, you have access to in phase, 90 or 100 degrees out of phase modulation on your left and right channels. We'll come back to that in a minute. Those bottom four switches as well are your subdivision for your left channel, your subdivision for your right channel, your feedback pathing, giving you options for parallel where left channel manages left channel, right channel manages right channel, a ping pong where the left channel feeds into the feedback loop of the right channel and gives you a ping ponging effect, or a series control where the left channel feeds into the right control and vice versa, giving you kind of like polyrhythmic skittering multi-tap delays that over time will smear into lush, warm, borderline reverberant tones. And finally down there, you have a sync control, and that is basically going to give you the ability to control your time and your modulation as a uniform control for both delay channels on the left and right, or the ability to control just one at a time, and it will always save where you have gone with that when you switch over to the other one or back to sync and out again. And when I say control over individual delay lines, I mean full control there. You have access to your time control, your modulation depth, speed, and waveform on each delay line independently of one another if you want it. And of course at the bottom you have your bypass switch and a secondary foot switch for tap tempo or pressing and holding for self-oscillation. And so that might sound like a pretty straightforward control scheme, but there is some really brilliant intentionality behind it. And that is, not only do you have everything necessary for kind of like a straightforward analog delay that you can quickly and easily control, but you also get to do something really special with this control scheme, and that is choose the kind of stereo experience that you want. Obviously, the most obvious and immediate stereo implementation on this pedal is going to be separate subdivisions, the ability to kind of just grab a quarter note and a dotted eighth note, tap in your tap tempo, and you are ready to go. You have complementary delay lines on each side. They are hard panned left and right, and your center channel is wide open for your dry electric guitar. But there are other ways to implement stereo delay, and they all have a lot of kind of specific use cases and intentionality, and you can access all of them in this pedal. Another great way of doing stereo delay is going to be the one that is the most common in like Strymon pedals and that kind of thing, and that's going to be the Haas effect, where you have a single delay line doubled on your left and right, and given a slight delay on one side. We're talking like, 5 milliseconds, 15 milliseconds, somewhere in there, to give it just a sense of width, even though it is the same subdivision on both sides. And that can be done by desyncing your time using that switch and setting the time control just so close to one another, giving you that just kind of immediate width without feeling like you're picking separate subdivisions on each side. There is, of course, a third way, one of my favorite ways to implement stereo delay, especially if you don't want polyrhythmic subdivisions on your delay lines, and that is stereo modulation, where a delay line feels like it exists in the center channel to support your dry guitar, but the modulation applied to it drifts through your stereo image. And that can be done using that aforementioned phase control underneath your division right. And that is the ability to kind of set it so that the modulation is rising on one side while it is falling on the other, or some sort of kind of halfway point where it kind of drifts throughout your middle channel as well, giving you the ability to create giant, wide senses of modulation without feeling like your delay is running away from the center channel. It is beautiful, it is unique, and it is really, really cool. And the really crazy thing about this is you can take that stereo modulation system, whether it is using that sync control to set separate modulation rates on each channel for width, or setting them out of phase with one another, or doing both, and then also applying that to two separate subdivisions. You can unlock so many different instantiations of stereo delay in this thing. Haas effect with unmatched modulation, separate subdivisions with in-phase or out-of-phase modulation applied to it. You could do two completely separate delay times, like forget the subdivisions, just desync your time, set them to two random amounts of time, and then set that series so they feed into each other, and then just kind of like listen to your sound design kind of build upon itself and create random moments of rhythmic complexity. And on top of all of that, you also have MIDI in and through on this device. The Meraki will let you do things like MIDI clock to your DAW. That entire intro song, all of the delay parts are MIDI clocked in, and it feels rock solid. I don't feel like I get any pitch warble, any bend, any awkwardness getting up to speed with MIDI. If you've used certain MIDI delays in the past that kind of get seasick and kind of warble in and out of time, you know what I'm talking about. I experienced none of that with this pedal. And at this point, I do want to point out that this is not what I would consider to be full-featured MIDI. And by that, I mean there are a handful of parameters that you can't control via MIDI on here. And unfortunately, there is not preset saving and recalling on this device. It's kind of a bummer to not have presets on a delay pedal like this, but the rationale behind it is effectively things like the mix and the feedback controls do not have a digital pot underneath them. They are fully analog. The pathing is fully analog, and therefore they aren't able to recall all the settings in a preset system, so there is no preset system in here. But what you do have is MIDI CC value controls for all of your modulation parameters, waveforms, speed, depth. You have control over the feedback path, your sync controls, your subdivisions, all of that stuff. So you still end up with a ton of controllability for MIDI, the ability to kind of like change subdivisions and stay clocked to your project or to your band or whatever it is that you're playing to in a live environment. Being able to do things like hands-free change between series and parallel, hands-free change between a kind of central dotted eighth delay or a more rhythmic quarter and dotted eighth on the left and right channels. All of that stuff is available via MIDI in this thing. And MIDI CC values over those things actually does open up a couple of really interesting things we'll touch on at the end of the video as well. Things like MIDI waveforms and MIDI sequencer engines and their ability to do really creative pitch jumps and drifting, unpredictable warble in your modulation engine. So we will get into all of that as well. Which brings us to the elephant in the room of this video, which is, who is this for? This is obviously a robust piece of gear, and it is not inexpensive. I mean, relative to kind of the current landscape of high quality analog delays, especially with MIDI, it is shockingly within the realm of rationale, let alone the fact that it has 8 MN3005 chips and has twice as many components and is a full proper stereo analog delay, which if you know of another one, please let me know in the comments, because I don't think I can think of a single other one except for one close to 10 years ago, it feels like. And I've not seen anything else that brings this to the table. So in terms of who this is for, if you are running a mono rig, if you are 90% of the time going to be playing into your singular amplifier and you just need a killer high quality analog delay, there are great other options out there for you. But if you are in a accept no substitutes headspace and want something that is true stereo, truly analog, and incredibly robust, this, I mean, it might be your only option these days, honestly, but it is also a amazing showing from Walrus Audio. It is a great piece of gear. It sounds incredible. It is easy to access, but incredibly deep in terms of feature set. So let's get to our sound samples and let's give the Meraki a listen. As always, before we get into our sound samples, let's talk through our signal chain and the context we are working in. I am playing my Music Man St. Vincent Goldie into the 29 Pedals EUNA, the Bondi FX Squish As, and the Bondi FX Sick As, the Bensons Germanium Boost, the Hologram Microcosm, and the Universal Audio Ruby, which is serving as our amplifier. We then go out from our amp to the Chase Bliss Generation Loss, the Walrus Audio Meraki Delay, and the Universal Audio Golden Reverberator. We then go to our DAW, which is Universal Audio's Luna. For the sound samples, we have the Germanium Boost and the 29 Pedals EUNA turned on. This is what our dry tone sounds like. We're going to break down the Meraki into some pretty digestible chunks because I think this is going to be the most effective way to get through this thing. We're going to start with the top layer of controls, the 2 feedbacks and the mix. We'll then go to our time and our tone, and then finally we'll move to the modulation and those switches down below, and we'll kind of explain the purpose for each of those motions as we get to them. Let's start out with our mix and our feedback. So you'll see we have feedback at noon and mix just above noon at about 2 o'clock, which is about where unity gain for our repeats is before we start moving into full wet territory. As you can see, the 2 sides of the pedal do have separate feedback controls. So you can kind of see, or you can hear right now that we're doing kind of a mono delay, and that's because we have our modulation turned off, our modulation completely in phase on both channels, and our divisions for our repeats set to the same. Basically, we're still running 2 separate delay repeats, but they are perfectly in time with each other, giving us the illusion of a mono repeat. But as you see, if we crank the regeneration on one side of our delay and take it down on the other, you'll hear our repeats kind of drift off to the side that has regeneration turned up. And of course, that's also dependent on the fact that we are in a parallel feedback path as well. As we get into some kind of bigger stereo images, we'll start playing with those feedback paths. But for the current setup, the only way you're going to hear the kind of like difference in the two channels is by changing the feedback. And as you can hear, this thing is set up to be able to get a lot of regeneration without running away. You can press and hold that tap button to oscillate the repeats, or there are internal dip switches, or trim pots, I should say, for your feedback on both channels to be able to extend out the sensitivity of that regeneration and get runaway oscillation a lot more quickly if you want it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the time and tone controls. The tone control is going to be a tilt EQ, and that time is going to get us from very short slapback delay speeds all the way out to a slightly over 1 second warm kind of clock noisy repeats. We're gaining these two features together because I think they play together very nicely as as you drag out the time on an analog delay, you will introduce clock noise, degrade your repeats a little bit, and that tone control can be a really useful tool for kind of either accentuating or mitigating clock noise as you want those kind of like long ambient drift. Okay, while we're talking about time, I feel like this is a good opportunity to jump into the kind of most obvious implementation of stereo in this pedal, which is going to be the ability to give each channel left and right its own subdivision. So let's get into tap tempo, those three subdivisions, and how they kind of play against each other for instant wide stereo ambience. But it's important to know that what we're listening to right now has that feedback path switch in the leftmost position, which is going to be parallel. You have three positions there. You have P, PP, and S. And P is going to be parallel, PP is going to be ping pong, and S is going to be series mode. The difference between the three is parallel pathing is your left channel and your right channel never really crossing over in terms of feedback interacting with each other. The repeats not kind of like getting into the feedback path of the other delay. Ping pong, you're going to have the left channel feeding the feedback of the right channel and creating something of a ping-ponging effect between the two channels. And then series, you are going to have the left feeding into the right and vice versa. Basically, the delay repeat from the left division feeding into the feedback path of the right division, and the right division in turn feeding back into the left one, giving you really interesting kind of extra rhythmic activities, including some really cool stuff that kind of passes across the center channel rather than giving you that incredibly wide left-right channel separation. So to illustrate that, let's go ahead and set up a very conventional quarter note on one side, dotted eighth on the other. A rhythmic combination everyone knows. It's kind of the most classic, that quarter and dotted eighth in series or in parallel with one another. But when you introduce ping-ponging into the equation, the pathing changes and it creates a different rhythmic component. So let's go ahead and go full wet for this. You will hear the right channel repeat hit first because it is the shorter delay time, then the left channel, and then you will hear a center channel as the kind of delay repeats kind of cross over one another. So those two repeats full wet in parallel. And of course, you have that series mode, which is going to be the left feeding the right and vice versa. You're going to notice a lot of syncopation a lot more quickly on this one and a lot more of a kind of skittering into an ambient bed. So for context, in this full wet context, if I'm playing tremolo picking, here's how the three of those will sound relative to each other. Obviously, you get into some really interesting stereo rhythmic complexities very quickly, even just by messing with a combination of the divisions and that feedback pathing. I say even only because we have more complicated and more nuanced ways of creating stereo images ahead of us still. Let's actually take a really quick detour back to really simple kind of mono single repeat analog delay. So we've got both of our divisions back at a quarter note. We have our modulation off, and we are at a single repeat on both channels. Just to kind of get a sense of what is feeding what. That ping pong effect is really just feeding the other channel, giving you effectively the exact same sound right now. Single repeat per hit. But if you go into that series mode, you actually do get one extra repeat on the right channel, which is just, like I said, an interesting note to make about how the two channels feed each other, even when they are operating in this perceived state of mono by doing the exact same stuff at the exact same time. But even in this context, if we take our feedback back up a little bit, but keep it sounding very mono. If we bring in something in stereo ahead of the Meraki, for example, we're going to use the Microcosm with with an engine that's going to do something a little bit more in stereo. We're going to use Mosaic that can often give us like a really great wide stereo image. We will then bring in the Meraki, even though it's supposed to be functioning, not supposed to be, but like it sounds like it's functioning as a mono delay right now, because it is true stereo operating just in parallel with one another. If you feed it unkind information on the left and the right channels, if you feed it different signals going into those two sides, you will get different repeats coming out of it. So let's take our mix down and kind of bring in something with the Microcosm doing some interesting stereo width, and then bring the Meraki in to hear how you can accentuate that without necessarily having to give it separate subdivisions on the left and right channels. Okay, let's not get too distracted. Let's take a moment and use that as an opportunity to dive into our modulation control, because feels like that's where we were going anyways. So your modulation has three main parameters and a very, very special additional parameter. Let's go ahead and start with the three basic ones on the left side of the pedal. You have your modulation, which is effectively your depth by default, or by holding that bypass control, you can set your speed as well. And then you have three wave shapes. Once again, hold your bypass and use that left division to switch between a sine, a square, and a random LFO. In case you haven't picked up on it, the glowing center point of the Meraki is going to tell you what your modulation engine is currently doing. And of course, this would be a great opportunity to widen our repeats back out with those subdivisions. And let's go ahead and jump over to that square wave. And as is always the case, my favorite is the random LFO. And the reason we jumped back to sine wave and a kind of slower, deeper one is because there is maybe my favorite thing about this pedal, definitely my favorite alternate parameter in this thing, is on that right side under division R, you have the option for 0, 90, or 180, and that is how far out of phase the left and right channels are in terms of the modulation, which means that you aren't just creating stereo image by changing the times of your left and right channels independently of one another. You can have them be in time or out of time with one another, for the record, but have them be in time with one another, but have the modulation be what is drifting them apart and back together, or or at least giving you the perception of drifting apart or back together. And it is my favorite thing because it is a way to get stereo width out of your repeats without it feeling like you are leaving your center channel guitar out to dry. So that 90 degrees out of phase thing that we're doing right now will give a sense of angularity. No one side seems to be taking control at any given moment, but it just gives kind of a width and a kind of wash to your repeats, which can also be really cool as you kind of reintroduce that serial mode. Or conversely, you can go fully 180, which means at any given time, the modulation that is climbing on the left channel is falling on the other one, giving you the perception of kind of a very consistent sway back and forth. And that motion is great if you want something really, really kind of like wide and kind of vibey in terms of movement in your stereo image, but you don't want it to be something overly rhythmic. The added benefit here is you can switch over to that random LFO for this. which again, when using this kind of faux mono delay, but in a stereo context, it can be a really great bit of ambient sound design for, once again, something like that stereo input of the microcosm. So let's do that again. And it's important to note that during this section, we are not using separate subdivisions for those repeats, nor are we using any reverb. So as you can hear, we have now arrived back at our kind of base level pseudo mono delay. And it is time for us to take a look at yet another way that you can create creative and beautiful stereo sound design in the Meraki. And that is the one switch we haven't taken a look at, which is the mod/time switch that is labeled underneath with sync L and R. As you've seen so far, you have a lot of shared controls and separate controls for divisions left and right and feedback for left and right. But the modulation and the time can also be set up separately from the left and right channels by using this switch. You have access to the left position, which is sync, which is keeping your left and right channels ganged to the same kind of settings for modulation and time, or the ability to make changes to just the left or the right, which can create really interesting additional kind of like pathways and avenues for stereo width and movements. As you watch me do that, you are realizing that it is in fact difficult to get the two channels perfectly in time with one another by manually setting that time control. But that's actually kind of nice because it gives you the ability to also dial in basically the Haas effect in this pedal manually if you want to. Like we have no modulation applied, but we can get that stereo width applied to the two repeats without any modulation if we want that as well. So you are now on your fourth implementation of stereo in this pedal, I think. As you can tell, you can even set separate tap tempos for the two if you wanted to. And now we are not just getting chorusing between our dry tone and our delay repeats with vibrato applied to them. We are now getting proper chorusing between our two delay repeats because we are only applying modulation to the right channel right now. But you can take it way further than that. Let's go ahead and switch over to the left channel and apply a different modulation shape and rate and everything. And then let them talk to each other. And it will save the states of the left and right separate positions. So if you jump back to that sync on accident, like you're just moving too quickly, and you jump that left channel and hit the sync, you can still get back to where you were. And once again, we've used no reverb in this entire, in any of these sound samples. So I want to wrap things up by taking a look at some of the MIDI functionality in Meraki. As we discussed earlier, there is no PC recall. There are no presets in this device, but you do have MIDI CC control over a lot of the parameters, basically everything shy of tone and feedback. And while that still gives us some kind of like base level obvious control, there are some interesting creative implementations and some additional sound design kind of complication that you can imbue this pedal with if you dig into the MIDI side of things. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple really basic use cases and some more robust and creative applications as well. At the very basic level, you've got some really great kind of like standard quality of life MIDI capable stuff, things like bypassing the pedal, changing the routing of the pedal, these subdivisions, and tap tempo. Let's take a look at some of that stuff. And it's worth knowing that a lot of what we're doing there is really simple CC messages. There's a MIDI dictionary in the back of the manual that will give you a list of everything that can be controlled in this pedal. But what we're doing here is really simple stuff, like a simple MIDI CC send for switching between series and parallel or ping pong. For that kind of top one of dotted eighth and U2 vibes, all we're really doing is using the MIDI CC for the left subdivision and the right subdivision, and based on the kind of like state of the MIDI controller, it is either keeping them in parallel as a dotted eighth, or it is changing one channel to a quarter note. But there are also some really interesting things you can do as well. Because you have separate CC values for things like left and right modulation, and because things like the Morningstar controllers and something like Ableton can generate MIDI CC waveforms, you can actually do things like ramp a specific parameter using the MC6. And so for this first example, let's go ahead with that D control we have in the top left-hand corner and ramp the depth of modulation right in this kind of very stock standard mono delay. And finally, let's do something kind of bizarre. And what we have here is kind of standard mono delay sounding thing. But that final preset in that top right-hand corner, you can see it says stand. And what I have set up is the ability to kind of use a sequencer engine to move between subdivisions on the right channel, giving us kind of quantized pitch jumps in time with our tap tempo. And of course, you can mix and match all of these things together. Okay, we have a glide engine from the microcosm pulled up to be very straightforward. It's not actually doing the pitch jumps that the glide does because I have the activity at minimum, and instead it's just giving us like a nice soft pad. Now, with all that kind of creative nonsense happening in the Meraki, all that automation, let's give that a listen.